Now, one important part about Angular is validation for input fields and forms and all of that. So right now, let's take a look. Here we got the to-do name and we want to make that required. And for this, we can use like an attribute for HTML. So let's switch over to our project. Let me just close what we have opened here. And we only want to have the task list component. And inside here, when we scroll down to the task title, that one, we can set an HTML attribute and it's called required. Now, after adding the required HTML attribute, let's switch over to the TypeScript. So task list component.ts. And now you can see here in line 31 for me, if task ng form touched equals to false. Well, and we now have to take a look because required is included in the like is valid field. So what we do is if task ng form dot valid, so if it is valid equals to false, so if it's not valid, we also want to return here for sure. Awesome. So let's take a look now. Let's open the application. And now if we try to submit something without entering a to-do name, you can see that it no longer works, right? So even if I click that and afterwards click on add, it is no longer working anymore. Awesome. So now it would be very nice if we could go ahead and display any kind of message to the user, because right now the user experience is not really very nice, right? Because I don't know what I have to do. I mean, it's a pretty easy intent to really think about it and say, okay, I just need to enter a to-do name. However, from a UI or UX perspective, we definitely need to adjust that and insert some really helpful error messages here. Inside of the task list component, scroll down again until you can find your input field right here. Right after that input, we will add a new div, and inside of that div, we will write down our error message. There we go, crazy unfolding here, div, and let's just say task title is required, for example. Awesome. So now when we start the application, we will for sure be able to see that task title is required. We will take care of that styling just in a second, right? So we now always see that task title, and that totally makes sense because we are just displaying it here. So now the important part about it is that we can actually use some sort of validation, not only here, right, when we call valid. No, we can also use it here. And for that, we go ahead and take that input field here and create a local reference again. So what we do is we create a local reference. For example, we call it new task and it's bound to the ng model. Awesome. So now inside of that div from that error message that we want to display, only if, well, that input field has no valid entry, we simply go ahead, asterisk, ng if, so we create an if statement only for that div, and it will only get displayed, or the div will then only get displayed if the if statement becomes true. So we only want to show that message when the form is invalid, right? That's what we call new task, or not when the form is invalid, when the input field is invalid. Let's call it like this, not the entire form. Right now we are focusing on the input field. So we take that reference now, new task, and then we can ask invalid. So if the new task is invalid, so the input field value is not, well, set correctly or empty, then this div will become visible. Let's see that in action. You can see that task title is required is true. And once I enter a value, hello world, it's gone, right? So just entering any sort of digit or character will for sure cause the error to be gone. And now we just need to bring it into the next line here, right under that input field, make it red, and then it will look like a typical error validation message. Okay, so now let's take that validation message here. Let's bring it outside of the input group. So let me just copy it over, remove it, and paste it down below the input group. So this is what it should look right now. We got the input group, which contains the input field and the button. And afterwards, we have that task title required. Now we want to style it like a real validation message. So let's go ahead into our CSS file. So go to task list component.css. And right inside here, we will create a new class. So write down dot, and then validation error. And what we want to do is we for sure want to set the color, so the text color to be red, for example. You can choose any color. Let's just get started with that and see if it works out fine. So go back to the HTML, go into that div and assign that class. Well, I like to do that after adding all of the ng stuff. So let's go ahead and do it here. Class equals to validation error. Okay, let's save it and take a look. Awesome. As you can see, you now got that right here. Maybe I want to make it a lighter red and add some margin bottom so that really the table is not following right after that message. So let's go to CSS again, and for red you can just use the color picker. If you click on red, for example, and I want to choose a darker one and a lighter one, something, yeah, maybe something like that. Okay, and then we want to add some margin bottom. So let's go ahead and write down margin bottom, so some space to the bottom, and we can use like 10 pixels. That should already be enough. Great. And as you can see, that now definitely looks way better, and we get an actual idea of what is going on here and why something is not working. Now I will make it a little bit brighter, just like that, and that should be definitely fine now. Yes, okay, perfect. Yeah, I definitely like that. You can also for sure change the font type, so you can make it bold or you can make it also italics, right? So this is absolutely no problem. You can just use default CSS for that. So when I start the application right now, I can immediately see that error message. And this is for sure not what we want to have. So because right now for sure there is no real value inside here because I just started the website, right? And the message should only appear once I touched the actual form. So we now need to go ahead and adjust it that way. So no errors or validation messages should appear until the user actively touches the task title input field here. We only have to add a very, very small flag here inside of our HTML where we already, so task list component HTML, right? We have that ngIf here, right? ngIf new task invalid, and we want to extend that and say new task dot touched. So only show that message if there is an invalid value and the user has already interacted with that user interface element, so the input field. When I now go to the application, you can see that no message is appearing anymore. That's awesome. Now let me touch it. And when I now enter something and remove it and then just go away from that input field, you can see task title is required. Now let's restart the application again. So just load the page. That's what I mean. If I just click in here, now it's touched. If I go away, you will see validation taking place. Task title is required. Awesome. Okay, so that's definitely already way, way better. Now, when I enter something here, like go to the mall and I just remove it like this and do not leave the input field, no error message is appearing, but we want to have that, right? Because we already interacted with it. So let's use the dirty flag too. So touched actually means, hey, did the user ever interacted with it? And dirty means like if there is a change in the actual value. So go back to the HTML and let's extend it one more time. And for this, really, it's a pattern that you will use a lot of times in Angular. You're gonna say invalid and new task touched, and we want to wrap that inside parentheses here. So new task touched or new task dot dirty. And dirty means, as I said, like if you enter or change the value of that input field, that flag will become true. Now let's take a look again. And if I now go ahead and write down go to the and start removing it and not clicking to leave the input field, you can see just right now that task title is required is now appearing without leaving the input field. And this is like the behavior that you know from the websites out there. So nearly every website is doing exactly this. So in either way, you have to interact with the form to, well, start let validation messages appear. And once you enter something and then remove the content, the message gets displayed. Great. So this is basic input validation, but there's a lot more to talk about. So let's just continue in the next video and learn more about specifying the actual validation itself.